think we got everyone in. Oh, more. Okay. Okay, well, hello and welcome everyone to the first episode of Diggin In Season 2. If you joined us last year for Season 1, welcome back. And if you are new to Digging In series this year, we are glad to have you along for this very exciting season of virtual programming. I'm Lindsay Randall, the host of the speaker series, and Diggin' In is a series of live presentations with archaeologists from around the country, co-sponsored by the Robert S. Peabody Institute of Archaeology and the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. Join us every other Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time through June for our presentations for this season. For our scheduled dates and presenters, please visit us at the peabody.andover.edu or at Massachusetts Archaeological Society's Facebook page. And if you enjoy our programming, consider expanding your impact by becoming a member of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. We are able to bring you such outstanding programming through the support of viewers like you. At the conclusion of the talk, viewers are able to submit questions directly to me via the chat function that is either at the bottom or to the side of your Zoom screen. We will then give our speaker time to answer as many questions as they can, with the understanding that we might not get to all of them. And today we are excited to begin Season 2 with Mr. Joe Bagely. Joe joined the City Archaeology program in 2011 as the fourth city archaeologist since 1983, not high turnover in that position. He curates a growing repository of archaeological collections currently housed at the City Archaeology Lab in Boston. He received his bachelor's degree in archaeology from Boston University and a master's degree in historical archaeology from UMass Boston. And Joe has conducted archaeological surveys from the woods of Maine to the Florida Everglades. And he specializes in both Native American and historical archaeological analysis, and in particularly the archaeology of Boston. So welcome, Joe, and thank you for joining us today.
Hey, everyone. Thank you all for being here. There's quite a few of you, and I recognize so many of you, so it's really great to see many of you who I haven't seen in over a year. So I'm going to share my screen pretty soon, about pretty much now. But I wanted to just kind of give a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. We don't have a ton of time today, so we're not going to go into depth on anything. But what I really want to use this talk to kind of give a broad overview of kind of what privies are, how they worked, where we find them in Boston, what types there were, some of the dates associated with them, and a very broad, big picture, kind of from 1,000 feet perspective. If you have any questions about what privies are, what we found in privies, and some more detailed stuff, we can get into some of that during the question and answer session at the end. So here we go. So what is a privy? Just as the basics, the privies are outhouses. Think of them very much in the same style of a porta potty that you would see at pretty much any outdoor event. The reality is that everybody poops and everybody needs a bathroom, and no matter your wealth, your class, or frankly your location, you need it to have some place to put your human waste. And especially in urban places like Boston, what that meant was that we needed to have privies, these outhouses that were created in backyards. I did want to make a contrast to more rural areas, because sometimes when you have a rural site where there's a lot of trees, for instance, nearby, you don't necessarily have privies on all historic archaeological sites, because not everybody had a structure for them and might literally be using the woods, proverbially, and then going outside. But ultimately, everybody had a bathroom outside. So how does it work? There are two main parts of the privy. There's the above ground part, which is the outhouse. Many times you'll see it referred to in historic documents as a necessary. Another term for it is a bog house, but that doesn't usually get recorded very well. If you're reading about deeds and records like that, what you'll tend to see is kind of polite terminology, or just completely avoiding the fact that it even exists by calling it a necessary or an outbuilding. The necessary gives you an idea of how needed they were, but also that even back in the 16, 17, 1800s, where everybody was using the bathroom outside, there was still some clear bashfulness about exactly what was going on in those places. But the part that archaeologists like the most is the vault. Vaults are essentially a tiny foundation. If you've been in the basement of a house, think of a miniature version of that. Vaults are located directly underneath the privies, and they can be a bunch of different styles, shapes, and sizes, and you'll see some examples in a minute. But ultimately, they were dug structures that were built specifically to contain the contents of, to hold the human manure and all of the contents that you would throw into the privy. And we'll talk more about what kinds of stuff ends up in the privy in a second. And there's lots of laws and restrictions on them, and we'll talk a little bit more about that too. Typically, folks that were building privies were placing them in their backyards, oftentimes as far away from their house as they possibly could put them, though sometimes it also meant that they were putting them up against other neighbors' houses, especially in urban areas like Boston. The goal was to keep your privy as far away from yourself as possible because of the obvious smell implications. And then oftentimes you would have a privy created out of either stone or brick. Sometimes they were also wood lined. And that was meant to kind of keep the contents stable inside of the outhouse. But then many people, especially in Boston, would line the exterior of their privy with clay. Boston sits on a massive clay deposit called the Presumpscot Formation that goes all the way up to Maine. So the Boston blue clay and the Maine clays are everywhere in this area, and so it's pretty easy to get a hold of clay. And that clay would essentially make your privy waterproof, because it would you would line the entire outside of the privy as you were building it. And that was really important because even in the 16, 17, and 1800s, folks didn't quite understand germ theory at all. But what they did understand was that if their well, which may be dug only a few feet away from their privy, hopefully deeper than their privy goes, but if the water content in their well started to smell like the inside of their privy, they knew that that was not a good thing. And so they were deliberately trying to keep their privies as watertight as possible to prevent the sewage that they were creating from leaking into the water system. But then there were the folks whose terrible job it was to actually clean out these things. These are called the night soilsmen. Here's an advertisement from, I believe, a newspaper in London. Again, there's kind of euphemisms for everything. The night man or the night soilsman. You would hire people to come to your home in the middle of the night, which is why they were night soilsmen, to dig out your contents of your privy with basically a gigantic spoon that they would lower down into the privy, scoop these things out, and put them into buckets and then cart them away. Typically, the night soilsmen would use the contents of the privy. They would get paid to empty them, but then they would take the contents of the privy and sell them to nearby farmers, because the contents were essentially composted manure. And especially when everybody's technically eating organically, the human manure was actually pretty good fertilizer, and so it would be reused in farms to grow food. And then you would buy the food and turn it back into night soil, and then ship it back off to the farmer, and it would be a circle of life situation with the food. But what would be a problem would be if you started to throw all your garbage in the privies, which archaeologists love, and we'll talk more about that. But essentially, the night soilsmen weren't able to actually sell the contents of your privy if there was too much ceramics and glass in it, because the farmers didn't want to spread ceramics and glass all over their fields. And so they would actually they would have to find some other place to dump it. And so many times in Boston, you would actually get these night soilsmen dumping the contents of privies into the edges of the city where we needed to create land, because it was natural soil, or at least dirt that could be added to the edge of the shoreline, building out land. And in places like Faneuil Hall, where we know we were making land as early as the 1740s and 30s even, to build Faneuil Hall, most of the land there is full of artifacts, and we're finding lots of seeds in there, like raspberry seeds and strawberry seeds, and food that was clearly passing through people's digestive system. So the theory is that the land that Faneuil Hall's built on is containing a majority of soil that was brought out from privies and dumped on the edge of the city, because there was no better place to put it. So broken ceramics and dishes ending up in night soil is another reason why people think that there's a general scatter of ceramics and glass in most farming fields. It's not that there's a bunch of farmers out behind plows holding dishes and cups, but that if they're ordering dirt from night soil men, that some of those artifacts that are in the privies are actually getting carted out to fields and causing a general scatter of artifacts in fields, which is an additional way to add artifacts to the site. All right, so I know everyone's seen an outhouse, but I really want to make sure that we understand how not different they've been from pretty much throughout the time. So I have three really big examples of kind of what to imagine when we think of these privies. The one on the right is a rich person's outhouse. Not everybody had these fantastic looking structures that were purposely built just to be an outhouse. This is an exceptionally large, exceptionally decorated outhouse for a very wealthy person, I believe in Virginia. On the far left, we have what would be considered an everyday kind of farmhouse privy, which you would see in Boston, in the Roxbury, Dorchester, Brighton, Charlestown area, places where you have houses with a bit more space around them, but not so much that they can have separate buildings necessarily, and definitely not wealthy enough to have these massive structures in the backyard. These are like an everyday build privy, and they typically would be tacked onto the side of buildings because you already had the structure that created somewhat of both a windbreak and a visual break. Somebody really wanted to look at these things. But this one doesn't seem to have a door. Most of them would have had a door, but it's a good example of kind of an everyday privy. The one that I think is rare outside of cities, but incredibly important to the story of Boston, is these kind of multi-seater kind of bench privies that we get, that not really benches, but like rows of privies that you get in downtown areas. So the one featured in the center is actually from a late 19th century. So they were sticking around for a long time in New York City. And I think this is the kind of thing that we really need to start envisioning more frequently in cities like Boston, where you have so many people living densely in areas, needing outhouses, and owners of property, not necessarily people that lived in the buildings, but the people that own the properties, building these structures in the back of houses and used communally, sometimes by one household, and by household it could be 15 families, but one building. But I think there's also pretty good evidence that privies are being used by multiple properties at once, which can really mess up the archaeological deposits as far as whose stuff we're looking at. But this is the kind of thing that I think would be pretty commonplace in places like Boston. And I'll show you what these look like on maps, because we actually have these in maps now too. All right, so here's our first example of kind of what I look for. So one of the things I wanted to share with you all is not necessarily like how to go find privies so you can go dig them up, because I want to stress this as much as I possibly can. Archaeological deposits are best left either completely alone or dug by a professional archaeologist. That's the best thing you can do for an archaeological site, is leave it alone. If it has to be destroyed, it should be done by a professional. And the reason why is that the archaeologists know what they're looking at and know how to interpret the artifacts that they're finding and can put them together into a meaningful story. But most importantly, those artifacts are always going to be kept together as a research data set that can then be used by anybody throughout time. And so we're not collecting these artifacts so that we all have a bunch of broken dishes in our labs, because nobody needs that. We're not necessarily finding new ceramic types, because we pretty much know most of what's been found out there. What we're really doing is collecting artifacts like they're pages in a book and assembling those into a story that we can then tell other people. And also, because this is science, other people can go back and check our data and re-examine what we've already found by properly documenting what we're finding, and either question our results or come up with a different interpretation if they want to, or confirm it. So I'm going to be showing you kind of how we look for privies in Boston sites, but by no means am I encouraging everybody to go running out and finding these. However, if you think you may have a privy on your site and you're worried about it being destroyed, let me know about it, because we may be able to do a dig out there just to be able to document it, but only if it's under threat. So the photo on the left is a project that came up back in 2014 called the Dorchester Industrial School for Girls. It's a girls' school that was opened in the late 1850s. And we were able to convince the owners to let us onto the property for the summer before they decided to do their development. Today, there's a schoolhouse on top of the property that you're seeing on the right. But all we really had to go by was the map, similar maps, a bunch of maps that you can see on the left. And it shows the main building, which is the brick kind of pink building. On these maps, the brick buildings are in red or pink. And an outbuilding, which is yellow. Typically, outbuildings will be things like carriage houses, barns, things like that. In this property, we only had one building, and we assumed that it was a carriage house, but that also was an indication that there might be a privy attached to or near the outbuilding. Because if you see on that map, if there wasn't a separate building for an outhouse, it would have actually been drawn on the map, and there wasn't one there. So the worry that we had going out to the site, it was almost a 2-acre property, was we're going to look for the carriage house and dig around the carriage house, hoping to find the privy. But if we don't find it, we have 2 acres, and we can't dig a 2-acre property with shovel test pits in the summer. So we put all of our eggs in the basket of find the carriage house, and then hopefully we'll find the privy. So we spent weeks looking for the carriage house. We found it. It was a little bit off from where we thought it would be, so it took us a while to find it. And then we basically chased the foundation, and we started actually, I think you can see my cursor. Savannah, can you nod if you can see my cursor for me? So I can see, okay, perfect. So we found the front of the carriage house here. And we chased it all the way around the edges of the outbuilding. And then once we got to the corner, in this back corner, we had the stone foundation take a right and start heading down this way. And we had a little brick foundation come off to the right, come off and continue into the direction. So at that point, we thought we might have had the privy. We excavated further. And what you see on the right is, as far as I know, the largest privy ever found in Boston. We excavated it over the course of the summer of 2015 or 2016, I can't remember. And what you can see is the brick lining that goes all the way around the edges. This area here, we think there might have been a tree or something that pushed all the bricks in. And then below about 1.5 feet of brick, there's a stone lining that goes all the way around the edge, the bottom of it. And over here, this is actually the outside of the carriage house. And behind this would have been the foundation for the carriage house. We just focused on the privy. It's a 5-meter long privy. And my guess is that along this wall here, there would have been those multiple doors that we saw. I think if I go back one screen, yeah, like this. I think this is what we have, is this very long, narrow privy with multiple doorways into it. There would have been walls in between each one, so there's a little bit of privacy. And one of the reasons why we think that that's probably true is that towards this end here, which is actually closest to the building, this photo doesn't show it really well, but the building is right here. The closest door to the building had literally the tallest pile of night soils and artifacts in it. So you can imagine the kids were walking out to the outhouse and just going into the first door stall, and that naturally had the most stuff. We're going to talk more about contents in general. I've never really given a talk about kind of like what a Privies look like in Boston, so I want to kind of go over that for a little while. Up until recently, a couple of years ago, I would tell everybody that Boston only has square or rectangular privies, and that if you want to see a round privy, you got to go to Philly. And for some reason, Philadelphia made the privies round and Boston made them square because we had math and science or something. But that was just competition with Philly. And then we dug next to the Old North Church, and we ended up finding all these oval and circular shaped privies. So my theory is completely out the window. But what you're seeing on the right side is half of an outhouse, or actually really a quarter of 2 outhouses, a wall from the nearby garden that we were digging next to went down the middle of it. This little thin brick wall here is actually the dividing property line. And then this oval would have been 2 different privies with a wall down the middle of it separating the 2 neighboring properties. And the way it looks on the maps, here we have this row house of bricks. And in the backyard, we have this little wooden addition off the back of it. And then there's the property line right down the middle. And so this oval would have actually sat on both properties underneath that little yellow addition on the back of it. And that property line's right in the middle. And so they would have walked out to the back of an addition on the back of their house, probably indoors the entire time, and used the bathroom in the back of that addition. And the oval-shaped outhouse there would have contained everything. This is a cistern here in the background, kind of a water collection for laundry. It ended up looking like the Olympic rings in the backyard, so there's all these circles everywhere. This is an area that was actually developed all at once. So that's why I think we have these kind of conjoined privies, is that all of these buildings were built at the same time by speculators that weren't planning on living them, but building them all at once and then selling them to individual property owners. So when they were in the backyard, they just built this kind of system of cisterns and privies across 4 or 5 properties, and then reburied everything. And some of those cisterns and privies were shared across multiple properties. So there's oval and rectangular ones too. And then so far my favorite, which is almost exactly a year ago today, we were out digging this one in the very cold winter. We actually were able to find 2 different types of privies in the same property. The one, it's a little bit hard to make out in the middle photograph, but the circle here is actually the kind of echo of a barrel that was buried in the ground, where the barrel was used as a vault. There was 2 side by side. We called it a double barrel privy. And that would have been underneath, either dug sequentially or two barrels under two separate bench holes, seats in the backyard. And then a little bit further in the back of the yard, we had a rectangular privy that I'm actually sitting in from the late 19th century. And these two different privies are about 100 years apart, 1860s, 70s, 80s. And this privy in the middle is 1720s, 30s, 40s. We actually had more artifacts in this tiny double barrel privy here than we did in all of this big 19th century privy. We're actively working on it right now. Lauren Poe, my project archaeologist at the archaeology lab, is going to be doing her master's thesis on this collection. It's a really cool collection that we haven't really released a lot of information on because we're still working on, but this is kind of the varieties of privies, these kind of smaller rectangular and circular barrel privies. So how do we date them? So there's a couple of kind of guiding principles for dating privies. The biggest one is that in 1652, the city of Boston actually passed a law that said that you could not have a privy less than 20 feet from the street unless your privy was 6 feet deep. So that gives us a lot of different parameters to go by. One, the privy should be more than 20 feet from the road, but also they should be at least 6 feet deep. And that's because for obvious reasons, they smelled horrible. And especially in the height of the summer, people would, they would really stink up the entire land, especially if everybody has one of these things in late August. There's actually rules against cleaning out your privies in the height of summer because it was just stinking up everything as you kind of cracked open the contents of these privies in the summer heat, which doesn't feel like it would happen today. But the 6 feet deep aspects of them are actually really beneficial to archaeologists because the depth of these privies being down 6 feet means that a lot can happen near the surfaces of the properties, whether it be development or landscape changes that could impact the upper few feet of the privies, but still the very bottommost deposits remain intact. And we have a lot of privies that have been found in Boston where the top 4 feet are completely gone, but that bottom 2 feet has 10,000 artifacts from 1750 still intact. So that depth of features really helped. The other thing that happened was in 1833, we had, in 1833, we banned people depositing artifacts into water closets or any other part. So the only option before 1833 for where you were going to throw your contents, your household human manure, was a privy. Between 1833 and 1875, we added a couple new things. We added water closets and a lot of drains to the system. And what that means is that you had the option in 1833 to go into a room or a closet in your house and use the bathroom, but it essentially was a seat that was connected via pipe back out to your privy. So you may not have had quite as much direct access to your outhouse. You may still have had an outhouse, but you were using an indoor bathroom. And that really changes how things end up in the ground because you're no longer visiting the privy quite as much. And the privy is almost more like a rain barrel for your human waste. In 1875, Boston added the main drain, which was really an ability to drain the water and the sewage of Boston out. And that's really when we start to have privies start to go away because now you can actually get your water closet to drain directly to a sewer. You still have to bring water to it. You can't flush it yet, but fairly soon after that, we have running water added to buildings. And then basically the need for privies goes away, except in places like the North End, the West End, the South End, Chinatown, areas where we have really dense populations where folks are still going, well, I have one indoor bathroom and I have this disgusting, but very much usable outdoor privy sitting there. I'm not going to get rid of 4 bathrooms in my backyard with my 30 people renting my home. So I'm going to leave the outhouse there. So we actually get in cities, even though we have running water, the hanging on to these privies and backyards going all the way up to the 1900s. In fact, in this date I found, this piece of data from a 1911 survey of immigrant households said that there was only one family out of 1,400 families that they interviewed that still had a non-flushing toilet, meaning a water closet. So even as late as 1911, there were still people who didn't have flushing toilets in Boston. So it gives you an idea about dating, how we date sites. But basically, by about 1875, outhouses should no longer be the norm, and they should also no longer be collecting artifacts. we're going to talk more about contents in a second, but I just wanted to kind of show you a map of kind of what we look for when we're trying to figure out how these things all work. So these are two different atlases from 1884 and 1890. This is from the Atlas Scope website from Leventhal Map Center. And we have, you can see this kind of rural estate in West Roxbury that has a very large house, maybe two different houses, some with outbuildings. There's probably an outhouse hiding somewhere in this property, if not in those little additions on the back. But then the map below from 1890, that little squiggly line that you see kind of enters through the property, that's actually the sewer line being installed and included in the map. So at this point, we now know that these guys don't really need to have outhouses because they now have the sewer line. So in addition to not needing the outhouse, we can say probably between 1884 and 1890, these guys would have gotten rid of their outhouse. What we're also seeing is a trigger in development. And you can see that already there's new buildings popping up in 1890 because now that people have running water and flushable toilets, it's an attraction, and it actually is increasing the development of sites. And we actually can see development following the sewers out to the ends of the pipes, and wherever the sewer went, more buildings were built in response because people were having to choose between moving to a property that had no bathroom and moving to a property that had a bathroom, and the demand increased for having running water for sanitary reasons. All right, last slide. Why the heck do we want to dig up privies? The reason why is because of the contents that they have. We're not itching to dig through human manure, although there's a lot of really cool stuff in there. The reality was that before trash collection in the late 1800s, you had very few options for what to do with your household trash, especially in an urban area. You could dig a hole and dump your stuff in the ground, just making a trash pit. A lot of people did that. You could throw it in the ocean, which even in the 1600s, that was frowned upon, but a lot of people did that too. But the most convenient place to hide all your trash was your privy, because it already was a 6 foot deep, possibly 4 by 6 foot hole in your backyard that nobody really wanted to look in. So you would throw your stuff into it. It made it so the night soils man couldn't sell your human manure, but it's not really your problem, it's their problem. So you would just throw your trash out. And archaeologists love that because essentially archaeology is the study of trash, and we want to go to where the trash accumulates. And so in Privies, we actually get these beautiful deposits of trash. And in those, we get the artifacts that people left behind, hoping that the night soils man didn't come along and pick up everything. But the data that we can get out of that is really important. So for instance, we can get diet. We can look at the bones of the animals that people were eating and find out what kind of foods they were eating. And from that, we can also get information of things like class. Were they buying expensive cuts of meat or buying poor cuts of meat? Were they buying the heads of animals, which would typically be very, very inexpensive? Were they buying the legs of animals, which would be a little bit more expensive? Were they not buying meat at all because they couldn't afford meat? Those are the kinds of things that we can look at and find out more information. We can also get some information about ethnicity. There are certain communities across the world that have dietary restrictions. And so, for instance, we were looking at the Malcolm X house recently in Roxbury, where we had in the same property a 18th century white Anglo-Saxon Protestant wealthy landowner that then sold the property, and it was built up and became an Irish home to Irish immigrants. And then in the 1940s, it was home to the Malcolm X and his family, who converted to Islam. So we have 3 different cultural groups living in this house with different food practices. And we can actually see that changing on the site, where we have a lot of cow bones in the 18th century because we have a lot of expensive meat being eaten. In the Irish immigrant phase, we have a lot of lobster bones and bird bones because these folks didn't have as much money. And then in the 20th century, we have a very diverse set of food because we have a lot of different ways to get food in the 20th century that were not available to the 18th and 19th century. But we also see a reduction in pig products because of the family converting to being Muslim. So we can see that in the ground. Health is a great way to look at it. We can actually look at the human manure itself and treat it through a scientific process to recover parasites, to actually find out how people's health was. Were they having a lot of stomach bugs? And then my favorite stuff is that things like, if you have somebody that said in their diary, if we're lucky enough to have a diary in historical archaeology, I never drank a day in my life, we can go to these privies and maybe we'll find 57 wine bottles inside their outhouse. And it's like, well, the written record says one thing, but the archaeological record doesn't necessarily agree with it. And that always makes archaeologists happy when we can say, it's different than the guy who wrote down. So that's kind of like that unwritten history, kind of the corrected history, the unedited, unvarnished history. Many Privy deposits are actually layered, where we can actually get different dates and different deposits and different people depending on the intactness of the Privy. So those are incredibly important. The preservation is amazing, especially in Boston, where we have the clay lining, where we actually keep the contents wet, and so we were pulling out clothespins and leather and stuff that would otherwise decompose in backyards. Those are actually in really good condition when we find them in privies. And then just fundamentally, that's the accumulation of artifacts, and then produce a lot of artifacts that we can then look at for huge amounts of data. I'm going to go back a couple of slides of this one, just to give you an idea of like the abundance of artifacts that we can sometimes find. Not every privy is like this, but this deposit's from an 1840s privy behind or next to Old North from a neighbor. And you can see that they, just from looking at that, you can go, oh, they had a matched set of dishes. Well, that's kind of important, because that means that folks are actually buying dishes all together and maintaining them. You can see this oil lamp that looks like it's metal, but it's in fact glass towards the upper part. So we have lighting from the inside of the house. It's actually a pretty expensive piece of lighting. We have a teapot, so we can learn about how the kinds of drinks that they were serving, and that they were probably hosting visitors, because they have a matching set of teacups and tea saucers and a teapot. There's a couple of buttons in that photo, so we can learn more about the types of clothing that they're wearing. It's hard to see, but there's actually dozens of bones in that photo as well. And then I know from washing these artifacts myself that the crumbliness of the soil is because there's thousands and thousands of seeds in the dirt itself from people's excrement. And that, when we were washing, we had to actually scoop off the seeds of raspberries and grape seeds that were floating to the top of the water, so we could use those as part of our analysis. And then we also took samples of the soil itself, so that we could, what's called flotation, and look at the soil and see how many types of seeds and food contents are in there. So the fundamental data that we get out of these privies is just enormous and incredibly important, and these kind of missing pieces of the story of the past. And that's why these privies are really important to archaeologists, why they need to be protected, but also why we keep talking about them, is because they're just such an exciting thing to find. They almost guarantee that we're going to get a lot of data out of them. And from, I'm a public archaeologist, so a lot of stuff we do, we deliberately try to get in front of people as fast as possible. And we know that people are going to be excited if they start talking about digging up outhouses. So we get excited because we know the press are going to show up, and they're going to love what we're having to share. And then everyone's going to talk about it, and we'll be able to people will know that archaeology is happening in the city of Boston. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing, and I hope that triggers some questions.
Thank you, Joe. This was great. Yeah, so if you guys have questions, please put them in the chat. I already have a few. But I do want to ask you a question, Joe. How many outhouses have you excavated?
I have personally excavated, it's 4 or 5. Part of the problem is that there's some outhouses that are like full of stuff. And then we found like an outhouse next to the Pierce Hitchborn house, which is next door to the Paul Revere house. A beautifully made outhouse, absolutely spectacular, and completely empty of anything from the 18th century. It was actually full of dirt from the yard next to the Privy, which ended up having some really cool artifacts in it, but it wasn't that like 10,000 artifacts from the family in 1712 on Thursday, that kind of thing that we were hoping for. It was more of a smorgasbord of the 300 years of history kind of redumped into the Privy. So we found more privies than I think we should get credit for, given that not all of them have those like bonanza of data that we hope for.
I did have a friend once excavate a privy right next to a tavern. She said it was like the best trove she's ever found and everything. Because
it doesn't get better than that.
Yeah. Okay, so a few of the questions. So one is, did cholera ever drive the privy policies in Boston, or any other disease?
So one of the reasons why people were really fighting for there to be running water in the city was to allow for better health reasons, basically, to be able to not wash hands necessarily, but have bathrooms that were not as susceptible to creating groundwater issues of seeping your cholera-filled excrement into the wells and that kind of thing. So it wasn't really a one-to-one thing, because it was a bigger task. It's not like the people of Boston woke up and said, "Oh, we don't want diseases in our water, so let's all build an aqueduct and a aquifer and create a water system." It didn't work that way. And the reality was that while people were aware of the issue, the real driving factor for the running water coming into the city was fire threat. we needed the ability to get water to downtown Boston so that we could stop fires like the 1872 Great Fire that took out Boston. By 1875, we had running water. And that's one of the reasons why we have those kind of cause and effects. So the disease aspects was so ubiquitous and so just accepted by everybody that it wasn't necessarily the driving factor, because it was always a factor. But what we do see is a marked decrease in the amount of diseases. I should have put it in here. I apologize, I didn't. There's a fantastic graph that the city archive shared of the outbreaks in the city of Boston in the 19th century. And you see this kind of creeping up of outbreaks of communicable diseases until about 1850. And then they start to drop back off again. And there were outbreaks, but the fact that people had running water and they weren't using these bathrooms that leached into the groundwater, it really helped keep the impacts of disease from being as bad on the groundwater system.
Cool. So another question is, if the outhouses are routinely cleaned by the night soilmen, why is there trash and other information still in them?
So what we're typically finding in a privy is the last deposit that's in the privy. And that could be something that got in there in one afternoon. It could be something that built up over a couple of months. So if these folks had an outhouse and they knew they were going to be moving on or building a new outhouse, they may not empty it for a couple of weeks, and then they might cap it and dig another outhouse next door. The other thing that we tend to see are these things called clean out episodes. So you might sell your house and move away, and the next owner come and see this disgusting outhouse and a bunch of stuff they left behind in the house, take everything out of the house and dump it in the outhouse, cap it, and move on. So those are the types of things that produce the deposits. What's a little bit rarer that we see is the nice gradual increment of artifacts over time because people clean them out. There's a fantastic privy, the Catherine Annie Naylor privy. It's the late 1600s privy in downtown Boston, where you can actually see, because they cut it in half so they could actually see the different layers. But you see these little scoops in the middle of the deposits where that's the night soilsmen coming in and cleaning out down to a certain place, and then it fills back up again. So if you dig it really well, you can actually see the cleaning out episodes over time. But yeah, it's not necessarily the entire lifespan of the outhouse that we see so much as it's towards the end. There's a place in Philadelphia that was found to the 95 project that I'm jealous of, where they found in a backyard where someone dug a barrel privy, like I showed you from the north end, and they filled it up and they capped it. And then they dug another barrel privy next to it, filled it up, capped it, dug another one. And they actually have a line of barrels all the way around the outside of the property, which are each individual time capsules. They were never emptied out. They just got filled and then they moved on to the next one. And that's a dream come true for archaeologists, because each one of those is a separate discrete time and a separate discrete story. And we can line them up in order and say, this happened, then this happened, then this happened. Haven't found that yet, but that would be nice.
Okay, so another question is, does the soil you are digging have any bad odors even today?
It depends on the conditions. We've had a couple that smelled a little funky, but we didn't have any really ripe ones. I've heard from colleagues that did work on the big dig projects that had quite a few privies that some of those stunk to high hell. We did have somebody that took the soils from the Industrial School for Girls privy and then brought them to UMass Boston to do the soil analysis and floated them. But they had to use warm water to break it up. And they said they stunk up the entire floor because all of a sudden the warm water kind of activated the smell again. So the contents of these privies are thoroughly composted, but that doesn't mean that the odor-causing bacteria haven't released their odor yet. They may not still be alive, but they're still producing, or they still have the contents of the bacteria that made the smell.
Right?
Yeah. But for the most part, the ones we have excavated haven't been terribly that bad smelling. If you got your face like really down close to it, it wasn't pleasant, but it wasn't terrible. Yeah, and I always joke with people like, yeah, you don't want to be with me on the red line going home after I've dug a privy, but then we've dug a whole bunch and it didn't really smell that bad. But the January one,
you out.
yeah, the January one that we dug was dug this time of year. So I think that one would have smelled pretty rough because it was really well preserved and really slimy soil, but it was also January and we were all freezing. And I think that actually kind of helped in some ways keep the smell down.
Someone wants to know if you find any or a lot of coal and or wood ash in the privy, or is that anything that's put in there?
Not always. We definitely find it in yard deposits. It's everywhere, but we haven't seen any like deliberate episodes of where someone's trying to cover up, like say the smell by dumping ash on it. I think one of the things that we have to remember though is that every single person in Boston had privies. And so if there's 100 or not, if there's 1,000 buildings in the North End, there's 1,000 privies in the North End too. So the odor wasn't something you could really escape. It was everywhere, especially in the summer. So I think it would have been kind of a losing game to try to block the smell because it was going to be a problem no matter where you were. So I haven't personally found deposits of coal or ash in privies, at least not ones that seemed like they were trying to cover something in the privy itself and not just emptying out a coal bin at the end of the privy's life. But yeah, we haven't found it looking like if that was the question, if we haven't found it looking like a deliberate attempt to kind of block anything.
Thank you. Another question we have is, what is the process you typically undertake for protecting the health and safety of yourself and your crew when facing the prospect of excavating a privy?
The good news is that the privies don't contain live really anything. So we don't have to really worry about that so much, which is good. The only time we've ever really run into issues with health and safety has been issues relating more about burials, where we have chemicals being used with human remains to either protect the bodies that are being put into the ground or prevent things from happening in the ground. So we don't really have as much of an issue with the privies themselves. I think we're more worried about protecting ourselves from getting the human manure all over us and then taking it with us on the train ride home. But it's not really a health risk per se.
Okay. Speaking of health risks and health consequences, Megan wants to know, were the night soils used to fertilize crops for human consumption? And if so, were there any health consequences that we know about from them?
So yeah, they would have been used to grow plants all over the place, especially for food for people. I think that would have a higher risk of potentially communicating disease because we're talking about very soon after creation being used as manure. Um, I don't think it would have necessarily been terribly increased of a risk because again, we're not dealing with folks that have nobody's washing their hands. Everybody has an outhouse, this kind of situation. But what it may do is speed up the transmission of a disease from a city to a more rural area. If, for instance, in the COVID days, if COVID was in the city and we took the human manure and moved it out to the rural spaces, then folks in that area may be more likely to get exposed to that. And that would have happened for sure all the way back through time. But I don't think that anybody was really thinking about that at all while they were working on this kind of stuff. They noticed the smell, but again, that didn't mean they noticed the disease because they didn't really have that germ theory saying the smell is related to the disease, but the smell isn't the disease situation.
Yeah. Another question, and then we're going to start wrapping this up. Do you happen to have any experience identifying privies in urban contexts using geophysical survey?
We haven't necessarily had to use geophysical survey. I think it would be an effective measure. I think the challenge that we have with the program that I run is that we don't have a GPR and we don't have the expertise to use it. So we would have to actually work with somebody else. And because geophysical surveys are expertise or really technical skill, we don't like to essentially use the kindness of all of our colleagues to have our digs borrow all the expertise from everybody. We would like to pay them, but typically our surveys are done completely for free without a budget. So we don't really have the resources to do a GPR. I think if we asked our colleagues to do it, they would do it, but I don't like taking advantage of everybody that way. But the other thing is that because we're digging on such small areas, the way that we test our sites, where we typically would grid out the site in 1 meter squares and dig down maybe every couple of meters, or on a checkerboard style, and lower the site, that's actually a pretty good technique for finding pieces of privies in backyards and then following that. Like we might find the corner of the privy and then chase it in all directions until we expose the whole thing. We've had really good luck digging multiple privies that way, but mostly because we're in such a confined space. Now, if we were in a 2-acre parcel like the industrial school for girls, and we didn't have the map that shows where the property, where the carriage house was, that would have been a great way to use the GPR because that would have showed up like the 4th of July on the GPR radar scan. But in these tiny little backyards, which may only be 6 meters by 12 meters in size, they're not that hard to find because there's not that many places for them to be. And also because we know they pushed everything to the back of the yard, the first place we look is in the back of the yard, and 9 out of 10 times that's where they are. So we don't need to use GPR. It's not that we don't want to, but it's just not our necessarily. It's sometimes easier to go a different route. If we had a GPR and the expertise to do it, we would use it all the time. Don't get me wrong.
Okay, awesome. Sort of, we've had a few people ask this question. So it's a two-part. What is the most surprising item you have found in a privy, and what is the coolest item you have ever found in a privy?
So for that I've personally found would definitely be for surprising would be we found a piece of coral, brain coral, that was about, I don't know, it was larger than the size of a basketball, which was really confusing when we first found it because coral has such a funny texture, but when it's covered in dirt, it looks really strange. Like, what am I looking at? It has this like pattern to it. But yeah, we ended up pulling out a piece of coral that was about that big from the ground, probably 19th century. It was from the Pierce Hitchborn house. Still not exactly sure what it was, but we're pretty sure it was basically, I went on a sailing trip because I'm a mariner and I brought back a piece of coral. And that's probably as exciting as it gets. And it may have just been a doorstop, but it was still pretty cool. The Industrial School for Girls site, that was surprising in the sense that it worked out really well for us. And it was really cool because we went to that site knowing that the school was just girls who were poor, who were from the Northeast area, from the 1850s, 60s, and 70s. So all the variables were gone. We knew that it would have to be a very small subset of the population. So we hope that we'll find something from them. But when we found the outhouse, we realized it wasn't emptied, and we pulled out, I think it was something like 3 or 4 dozen dolls of porcelain dolls overall, pieces of them broken. We think they actually were deliberately broken by the girls. So that was one of the situations where we were surprised to see it, but also it was exactly what we had hoped to find. But you don't, any archaeologist on this kind of goes onto a site hoping to find some things and not necessarily getting it when they go there. But it's really nice when the site really delivers in that way. And that site was really special and had just an incredible amount of data that we could be publishing on that site for the rest of time, basically. But that's one of those ones where we were so surprised at the finding of 5-meter long privy and then finding all of these artifacts from the girls that were left behind.
Excellent. So our last question.
Doll hands coming out of the ground.
A little creepy. So our last question that we're going to have today is a little general for you, Joe.
Okay.
How many digs are ongoing in Boston in a regular year, not COVID pandemic? And what is the oldest site and what is the newest site?
Okay. So on average, we probably have between 3 and 4 digs happening in Boston, and they'll range from an archaeologist on site during construction, watching construction, making sure that nothing's coming up, because we think there might be something there, but it's not quite ready to be dug or not quite good enough to dig, but there could be something, so we'll have an archaeologist there, to full-on open excavations. We'll typically do 2 or 3 a year on a normal year, but then there'll be other projects, many of which are responding to development or changes happening maybe on the Harbor Islands or in downtown Boston. On the Boston Common, those kind of places.
Or a hole just regularly opening up.
Yeah, or a well opens up in a park and then we go running out to go lower our iPhone down on a rope. So yeah, various types of things like that. Which, by the way, we got a GoPro because of that project. So now we're going to be in the high-tech classes. The oldest site that has been found in Boston was not one of my digs, but when they were trying to find places to put the sewer treatment plant that's now on Deer Island, they were looking at Deer Island and Long Island as places to put the sewer treatment. They ended up finding on Deer Island a massive native archaeological site that dated back to at least 8,000 years, and that's currently the oldest known Boston site, although we know that native people were in Boston at least 12,000 years. And the most recent site that I think we've actually looked at would be my dig in Chinatown, where we were pulling out Doritos bags, new edition self-titled tape from 1984, I think, stuff that was basically my age coming out of the ground. But we were, so that we actually have a really important collection, even though it doesn't sound that old, but a really interesting snapshot of Chinatown in the 1970s and the 80s. So I would say that's our most recent dig. I think the more we look at historical archaeology, the wider the net that historical archaeologists are are casting for what does archaeology mean and what does historical archaeology mean. Just for an example, I'll say real fast, I had to organize a conference recently, and I was trying to find a place to put a paper on a 1750s house in Colonial Williamsburg, and I had to find a session that matched that topic. And that in 1970s, 80s, and 90s, that was what everybody did for our historical archaeology. Most people did that kind of stuff. And I had this paper on a 18th century house site, and I had no place to put it because it didn't match anything else that was going on in historical archaeology. But I had an entire session of 20, I think it was almost 15 papers that were on archaeology from the 20th century. So like it gives you an idea of where our historical archaeology is really going. We're becoming a much more inclusive, as far as the time goes, a much more inclusive kind of look at what history is. There's a lot of people doing contemporary archaeology of homeless populations, where we're literally doing the archaeology of people who are very much still there today, maybe the day before we showed up, or at the same time that we're doing surveys. So it's really just taking a look at stuff and people and time, and not setting a really strong beginning or end date for what the time range really is. What's important is the question that you're asking.
Okay, well, thank you, Joe, for joining us today. And thank you to our viewers for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you at our next lecture, which will be Wednesday, February 10th, when we are joined by Dr. Whitney Battle-Baptiste, who will be speaking about Black feminist archaeology. And again, we rely on supporters and viewers like you, so consider supporting our outreach by becoming a member of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye, everyone.